We will all die. There comes a time in our lives when we are faced with death and we suffer because of it. From contemplating death, awareness and empathy are born as selfishness is buffered by the fear of dying. In other words, when we witness the death of others, we realize death will also reach us. Empathy is born out of self preservation, or it doesn't. In every moment, there are two paths we can take. Either we face hardship to the best of our ability, and hope to survive, or we run away from hardship and so push on others who tend to push back. In the second case, fear takes control of our behavior, and so we lack the experience that makes life worth living. The more we try to push responsibility on others, the more we become unwilling to be responsible for our own actions. Without facing our own mortality, it is impossible to walk in other people's shoes. As relatives, pets, livestock, crops, and wild game die, our day to day schedule is interrupted and we become sad. Our efficiency as a unit is compromised and we become less certain about our own future. Having witnessed death, self restraint now seems like a milder sacrifice than before. Empathy leads to restraint, and restraint leads to self preservation. Or so it was for millennia. Progressively, in the last 20,000 years, climate change and the disappearance of the megafauna on which we heavily relied has led us from a symbiotic relationship to parasitic relationships. As the balance of nomadic hunting livelihood is broken due to mass death, we give birth to symbolism. Practical belief, space, and experience become useless in the face of new conditions, but are slow to change, which prolong suffering and ultimately lead to social collapse on such a regular basis that the modern economy relies on the resulting consistency of anarchy to function. Cunning predatory behavior is a trait that we've developed in chasing and trapping prey for the last 2 million years. However, this behavior has led to the progressive addition of more and more collective knowledge, such as tool making, tracking, trapping, skinning, herb lore, etc., that needs to be passed on through generations. As such, our childhood lasts longer than those of much bigger animals, not because we require the time to physically develop, but because we require the time to absorb all the collective information needed to function within our social unit. Cunning can be self destructive, especially when predation is involved. Nature is not constant, although it is constantly changing. The speed at which it does so varies. To the individual, these patterns operate on a scale too great to comprehend, and so natural disaster and mass extinction are interpreted through the lens of what we already know. Yet what we already know has failed to protect us from disaster. Our interpretation of what is happening is ultimately anthropocentric, meaning that we see the world as made by man or for man. In other words, when disaster strikes, it is because of the evil actions of man. When we experience good fortune, it is because of our good deeds. Everything is because of man. Whatever happens in the world, we believe it is specifically happening to us. When acquaintance dies, we feel sad because we ultimately affect our routine. It ultimately affects our routine and makes us think of our own mortality. Yet for everything that happens to be directed at us, imply that some sort of intent or will directing these events and paying close attention to everything we think or do. Anthropocentrism requires that the world be in control of some transcendental entity that plays favorites, thus the allures of divine being that have created us in their image. In other words, the world didn't create man, man created the world. Anthropocentrism gives rise to symbolism. Symbolic behavior subverts reality to belief. In other words, it becomes more important for us to believe in specific arguments and act out specific ritual to please divine beings than it is to know how to obtain air, water, food, and shelter. These arguments and rituals are supposedly dedicated to the preservation of resources, as divine beings are believed to produce these resources according to our merit, but these end up consuming resources without producing any. The more our environment changes, the more we invest resources in trying to attain divine intervention. As our beliefs consume more and more resources, we interfere more and more in other species' natural cycles in order to benefit from their fertility, which diminishes the more we interfere. In the end, the actions that we feel protect us against death actually make it more probable. That is symbolism. While the initial spread of and diversification of hunter-gatherer lifestyle enabled many of us to thrive, the prevalence of symbolism following the intergenerational trauma of mass extinction causes empathy and social cohesion to be replaced by predatory exploitation of the less fortunate. Our relationships with each other become secondary to our relationship with imaginary beings that conveniently tell us that what we want to hear. In all cases, we start hoarding resources as our desires run out of control. Surplus is hardly new, as the changing availability of resources mean that we need to produce more when possible in order to survive when resources are unavailable. The issue is that surplus, together with symbolism, create conditions in which we can survive without having to produce. Most of us alive today survive due to surplus and symbolism, and not because we produce or know how to produce necessary resources. We consider money, religion, nationality, race, gender, and other symbols as more important than air, water, food, and shelter. We spend more time distracted by entertainment than we do with the people who provide us with necessities. As such, we do whatever we want and claim it as the will of the idols we worship. As such, without surplus, we would die and our beliefs would be void, because without necessity, there is no reason to question existence. If you survive without needing to farm or build, you won't find it important to farm or build. If you survive without your family, you won't find family important. If you survive without thought, you won't think. The obvious issue is that not everyone, not even half of the human population, can live in such a way, yet it is imperative that everyone believes they can. Farming, building, family, and thinking are still very much necessary for our survival, even if we do not think or invest in them. That is the definition of taking life for granted. Unfortunately, if too many of us take life for granted, no one is left to produce essential. The balance between the actions I'm allowed to take as an individual and the responsibility I hold as these actions affect others is broken. As we come to depend on surplus, we come to live in beggar collectivities and so interact with more individuals that we can consciously register. Just as we are unable to and unwilling to keep track of the resources we consume, we are unable and unwilling to keep track of those who produce these resources for us. Since we are not held accountable by those we rely on, we never come to feel responsible for our own existence. We never question our own mortality, instead using surplus provided by exploitation to blind ourselves from learning from the death of others. Our existence is shaped purely by symbolic belief, which is in essence become a justification of our own greed. As we act on desire, we become dependent on mass exploitation. Exploitation is both predatory and parasitic. On the one hand, exploitation requires the use of force. Violence is necessary to make sure that the exploited remain exploited. On the other hand, exploitation allows those benefiting to delegate violence and so live in the semblance of peace and prosperity, i.e. the first world, some of the first world. Violence essentially prolongs the chaos of megafaunal extinction and climate change to keep the resulting refugees in a position to be exploited. The symbolic illusion of gain, eternal life, that replaces actual survival leads us to suffer and die prematurely. Unfortunately, one of the greatest effects of exploitation is the inability to think and so be accountable for our actions. Thinking, when in an exploitative environment, is purely directed towards furthering exploitation, even as it leads to death. The mind is part of its environment, and so if exploitation is all that it knows, then it will try to find a solution to hardship through exploitation. Even as we don't want to be exploited, we exploit others. Fewer and fewer people die naturally, while more and more die for their beliefs. Fewer and fewer people are aware of their beliefs, while more and more conflate their beliefs with reality. As such, very few who kill and die for their beliefs are conscious of the many actions they take, leading up to murder and death. Morality becomes arbitrary. As lack of reasoning causes increased fear of dying, life is a constant search for instant gratification. If thinking does not cause pleasure or inflate ego, it is judged pointless. If beliefs do not justify acting purely in self-interest, they are forgotten. Violence becomes prerequisite for life, just as we claim to believe in peace. We claim to have a right to survive, yet we are incapable and unwilling to survive without predating and parasitizing others. As such, the only way for us to live is by forcing others to take care of us, which is impossible without symbolism. Without it, we become those we exploit. Without it, those we exploit, the majority would stop working and we would die. Without the promise of eternal paradise or infinite wealth, would so many a poor man give his life for the sake of his king or his employer? With each new generation, the mind distances itself from the actions that directly sustain it, and so cause more ignorance, which leads to more symbolism, which leads to more exploitation, which leads to more ignorance, so on and so forth. Clearly, an individual's choices are solely his to make. Whatever our beliefs may be, our decisions impact everyone and everything around us, and in turn we are impacted by everyone and everything around us. Selfishness, to feel pleasure, is impossible without some compromise. The rational mind is able to understand that sustainable pleasure, albeit limited, is much more preferable to immediate exploitative pleasure. The distance between our belief and our ability to survive creates systemic inequality. Inequality is born when we do not find it necessary to find and manage water, food, and shelter because someone will do it for us. We may ultimately die from our mistaken beliefs, but not before causing the suffering and death of those around us, which may carry the same beliefs forward and so cause the progressive degradation of culture and quality of life in new generations. We may die self-righteous, but once we are gone, who takes responsibility for the consequences of our delusions? No one. Consequences flow unchecked as new generations are too busy justifying their own selfishness to pay attention to the past or the future. The solution is clear. We must realign our beliefs with reality and reinstate our direct environment in our day-to-day lives. Otherwise, we will create a depth of consequences that will keep accumulating until our extinction, which is already a reality for thousands of other species around us. Globalization, just as the imperialism that came before, is collective insanity. Life is proximity. Proximity to air, water, food, and shelter. By extension, we use almost everything, objects, animals, people, at our disposal as tools in order to obtain resources. The closer the resource, the easier it is to use. To make sense, to be a rational or responsible human being, is to be aware and make use of what surrounds you. When proximate relationships are consistent, life, the entire ecosystem necessary for the sustenance of one individual, become more complex but also less capable of adaptation. In an ecosystem, every species plays a part that no other can play. The more species there are, the more specific the role played, since the same amount of limited resources must be shared. However, the more specific the role played, the less likely the species can adapt to change. Ecosystems that become too populated thus become fragile under the weight of their own biomass. The same rule applies to society and civilization, as they are idealized anthropomorphic rendition of our interactions together. Society gives the illusion of unity and order on a scale that is impossible to achieve. Society and civilization are wishful thinking more than they depict what is. In reality, we interact with everything close by, more so than we do with random human being far away. Families and communities relate to their direct environment and so are limited in their growth by the availability of resources and the time needed to obtain them in their specific environment. Society and civility as concepts depend entirely on the continued existence of family and community to exist. Yet those of us who speak of society and civility as if legitimate continuously need to interfere in the function of family and community in order to take from them the resources that they hoard. In a natural environment, either we look for resources or we learn to increase their availability where we are. Availability of different resources give rise to different types of family and communities. As different people and life form look and manage different resources, cooperation and specialization provide a total that is greater than the sum of its parts. Where an individual could have stopped or taken time, another can get the job done. Where one individual would not have enough strength, two might. More resource gain and less energy spent become the standard of new generation. Hardship is lessened and the population grows. However, the common experiences of the previous generation leading to cooperation and success are not the same as with the new generation. The structure of the group has to change in response to the new conditions and experiences. When the structure of the group is too slow to change relative to the speed of nature, children grow up being taught obsolete information that create further strain on pre-existing social structure, i.e. symbolism. Some actions become purely symbolic and so use up more resources as returns diminish. Without surplus, generational gaps are easy to change. Since the discomfort of their situation lead new generations towards change. However, when surplus is involved, discomfort is lessened and so is the lesson to be learned. Legitimized by the beliefs of our parents, those of us raised in abundance never experience true necessity, and so when scarcity eventually replaces abundance, as it always does, we lack the experience to cope and instead attempt to keep consuming at the same rate. Since there is not enough resources for everyone to act the same way, cooperation becomes competitive. Cooperation becomes competition in every possible interaction. When we stop cooperating, we produce less, further increasing competition until family and community cannibalize each other through war and exploitation. Surplus beyond seasonal change is waste. Resources always become scarce because of waste. Just as with individuals, families and communities that misjudge their worth and misuse resources are more likely to steal and murder than they are to change for the better. Cooperation devolving in competition means that symbolic behavior once directly connected to the family and their resources is maintained as a tool for exploitation. In an overpopulated, hyper-competitive social setting, the most efficient means of survival is not to gather resources, but to be the middleman between people in order to steal their labor and resources. The structure of exploitation grows until one individual can claim the resources of billions of others for himself and be worshipped as a god, while the environment no longer provides for anyone else. We call the resulting infrastructure wonders of the world, and we worship the men who had them built. Simply put, we worship exploitation and the resulting mass death it produces as some kind of transcendental human experience. In exchange for a feeling of belonging we no longer get from family and nature, believers of symbolism provide resources to strangers despite suffering for it, because thousands of middlemen are constantly convincing us to look for gratification just as they do. Believers, by their nature, believe in order to run away from the pain of existence. We ask of authority figures, fictional or not, what we are unwilling to do ourselves, and so we are easily stopped for becoming reasonable. Instead of creating value through collaboration with proximate life forms, which require compromise and sacrifice and restraint, believers will ignore proximity in order to find a wealthy middleman that will instead tell them to be selfish in a form of paternalistic altruism. The more ignorant we are, the more we believe ourselves to be good, and so good becomes whatever we want, and evil is whatever we fear. So evil is death, and good is whatever isn't death. Just like cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chicken, geese, and other domestic animals, we abandon the skills needed to survive in our environment and instead expect to be handed our necessities in exchange for dehumanizing labor, which is very much counter to the promise of an easy life needed to get us working. Employers and politicians, some of the middlemen claiming authority today, do not need to fulfill their promise since we do not have developed the ability to think critically about their promises. If lying is all we've known, how could we judge whether or not we've been lied to? If we suspect it, who would we trust with this information? If employers and politicians cannot be trusted, why would we trust liars and judges? Confusion and quiescence reign supreme in the masses as we are made to believe that we deserve our suffering. Again, how would we know otherwise? Stupidity remains systemic as long as human beings delegate their basic responsibilities as individual, water, food, and shelter, to others. In other words, as long as we force other beings, as long as force is being used somewhere in the world to produce all that we consume, we are content living as domestic animals and parasites. When faced with existential crisis caused by boredom and dehumanizing labor, believers invest more and more in their beliefs and in the middleman peddling them. As middlemen promises more and more to their believers, they require scapegoats when promises are broken. Hatred and fear against imaginary enemies causes radicalization of individuals. Radicalization is the final manifestation of entropy in social activity. Proximity is completely disrespected until families and neighbors hold belief that encourage them to kill each other. Radicalization leads to genocide, and genocide to extinction. The constant chaos caused by such violence enables the middleman, the peddler of beliefs, to live in excess. This time is used to swindle more believers. Middleman becomes the wealthy, overreaching elite minority, while the believers become the poor, underachieving masses. Logic and so communication outside of exploitation become impossible. In other words, we only speak to each other when we are attempting to steal and swindle, and so we have no time to think of anything other than stealing and swindling, which in our delusion we interpret as benevolent altruism. In other words, we can kill others and believe that it is necessary. It is good. We can rape, we can murder, we can steal, and believe ourselves to be good people. Citizens need politicians and bureaucrats. Christians need priests. Patients need doctors and drugs. Athletes need coaches. Fans need actors and athletes. Children need teachers. Adults need employers. The elderly need personal care workers, etc., 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 until everyone is estranged and alone in an overpopulated world. Human beings do not have the intrinsic ability to restrain from consuming resources, as resources scarcity is inevitable. We try to avoid scarcity and so build our communities and beliefs to prevent it. When given the chance, we take as much as we can, not as much as we need, because throughout evolution, throughout the last 2.5 million years, to want something and to need something has been one and the same. When want and need diverge, we start observing symbolic behavior and become the cause of our own demise, even in good natural conditions. Strangers are people we know nothing about and do not care for, yet interact with for the sake of exploitation. Symbolic beliefs, beliefs not rooted in direct survival, are the only reason to talk to strangers. Every second with a stranger is a second less with those we know and love, which is negligence. The less time we spend with family and neighbors, the more they become strangers, turning everyone into an anonymous, powerless laborer. Symbolic beliefs create systemic exploitation. The more exploitative we are, the more we interact with life outside of our direct proximity, creating strangers and denying accountability for our actions everywhere we go. The less exploitative society is, the more we interact with people in direct proximity, which can hold us directly accountable for anything that we say and do at any given time. If I can't physically go to your door and question your behavior, then I am a stranger to you, and we cannot hold each other accountable for any wrongdoings. Why would we interact? Social competition, when it replaces cooperation, leads to exploitative specialization. Survival of the individual requires generalized behavior, but social structures limit the behavior through specialization, which is fine as long as the individuals can interact with the people they rely on. Specialization may ultimately rob the individual of the experience and know-how associated with survival, since specialists become dependent on other specialists for survival. This becomes a problem since without direct experience in gathering and transforming resources, a generalized endeavor, it is impossible to judge their value and by extension the value of our own lives. Yet bartering, negotiation in the trade of resources, is integral to specialization and require pre-established trust to function. As long as people are close enough to be held responsible for their actions, bartering poses no problem. But once there are more people in a system than the individual is able to care for, accountability in trade becomes impossible. Bartering with those we know means that people cannot overvalue their own goods and undervalue the goods of others. But bartering with strangers offer no such guarantees. In fact, the goal of bartering with strangers is precisely to cause unfair exchange. Trade specialists, a type of middleman, which will ultimately force strangers to produce more in exchange for less, and argue that they are stimulating the economy or giving purpose to the lives of those they exploit. The transition between fair exchange and exploitation happens throughout generations, making it harder for individuals to perceive. Proximity to resources, just as proximity to people, is not respected. The elites thrive regardless of where they are in relation to the resources they possess, just as long as there are gullible strangers to exploit. Since there is no correlation between experience and survival, waste becomes an adequate means of retaining power over others, whereas smaller, generalized societies of the past and present immediately recognize that waste makes life harder for everyone, friends and family included. People become the only resources elites need. So long as resources are wasted, more labor will be needed in order to replace the wasted resources. The more waste there is worldwide, the easier life is for the wealthy. Waste leads to scarcity, scarcity to poverty, and poverty to people desperately seeking survival through established wastefulness. It becomes imperative for the wealthy to spread exploitation, the interaction of strangers, as far as possible in order to be as far as possible from the stranger with anger and violence. The political spectrum to which modern exploitation operates exists insofar as it promotes exploitation. Liberal concepts such as scientific objectivity, universal rights, gender politics become essential in disseminating absolute truth that encourages interacting with strangers and prevent individuals from developing the skill to communicate and compromise with family and neighbors. Time that would be used to debate is time spent at daycare, school, work, the club, the gym, the retirement home, and otherwise interacting with strangers. There is very little difference between modern liberalism and colonial paternalism, one of the mechanisms of empire. Conservative ideals do their best to protect existing exploitation and those that benefit from said exploitation, while liberal ideals give the illusion of inclusiveness to the conservative status quo. Both depend on exploitation to operate. Both are operated by and for the benefit of a minority of elites. Both require that the majority of human beings be treated as domestic animals in an industrial complex. The bigger the size of the network, thus the need of society as a concept, the more specialized the specialist needs to be. Consequently, specialization becomes a practice in exploitation since it has nothing to do with survival. The roles of individuals become so diminished and disconnected from the resources they need and from each other that we feel completely useless outside of school, work, and entertainment. If we're not being exploited, we're nothing. People who do not value themselves cannot value their children, and so parents send their children away to strangers to become good laborers in a factory setting. A good laborer puts work before family and is rewarded with a broken home, and so the cycle of anonymous consumption and production is repeated. It is more important for the individual in modern society to work than it is to be a good husband, wife, or child. These things you can get away with. You can get away with being a poor husband, a poor wife, or a poor child. But you cannot get away with not working. An individual can be as abusive as he wants toward others just as long as he is making a proportional amount of money to pay fines. However, when a poor man is abusive, he is a danger to society because he doesn't have a job and he doesn't have the money to pay for his crimes. There are thousands of likewise fragile arguments individuals today choose to ignore in favor of whatever little comfort they found. Having been abused by family members and in turn abusing them, the poor can no longer rely on proximity to fulfill their needs and so become dependent on the elite, the cause of their suffering for survival. Shame of our behavior guides us toward meekness. We would like to accuse our abusers, but in our anger towards society, we abuse as well, and so we stay silent. The rest of our surroundings are forgotten with the family. Work and entertainment, once family is divided by common traumatic experience, become the only life we know and wish to live. Wealth correlates to the concentration of poor people in a given space. When enough strangers get swindled out of the resources they once used to survive, they gather where resources are, which means that populations become concentrated in areas where the wealthy live. Cities, where strangers live side by side, exist slowly due to exploitation and expand in order to sustain ever more exploitation. The greater the concentration of human beings, regardless of the quality of life, the wealthier the elites. Just like physical distance, overpopulation creates anonymity that prevents the poor from holding anyone they interact with accountable for their action, including themselves. Anarchy is extremely beneficial. Overpopulation is the single most self-defeating action directly caused by poverty. The poor reproduce excessively because it feels good, effectively creating more scarcity and reinforcing elite control over families and communities. Paternalist culture created by the wealthy for the poor is filled with thinly veiled encouragement to reproduce. A bigger workforce means more wealth for the wealthy. Distance, however, remains the primary means of exploitation. Overpopulation is impossible without it. Transportation is the ultimate method of wasting resources. The farther resources travel, the more they switch hand, and the more resources switch hand, the more they are wasted, which is good for the wealthy. Responsibility is delegated to the most physically involved in the process, who risk their lives to remain poor, while those less involved in the physical process are already wealthy and only stand to gain more. Those least involved believe themselves to be the most involved and the most responsible, whereas the most involved believe themselves to be the least involved and the least responsible. Without such upside-down beliefs, systemic exploitation is impossible. Where competition and specialization have not produced exploitation, expansion of exploitation, and so transportation to, from, and across the region will make sure that the sudden disappearance of native resources and the sudden appearance of foreign trash force people to participate in exploitation in order to die of pollution later rather than sooner. Whoever refuses to participate in globalization is deemed a threat and a terrorist by the elite. The development of the individual becomes stunted as there is no longer a direct relationship between the family and resources. Family is proximity to time and space. Family means the same resources are being consumed, leading to common genetics and hereditary traits. When there are no resources to gather, there is no reason for parents to teach children. When there are no resources to gather, there is no reason to live. Plain and simple. Those who disagree are the poor and the elites who no longer know their environment or how to gather resources, and so misjudge the value of their own lives. When less and less parents teach children how to extract and transform the resources around them, the practical traditions that make up our heritage are forgotten along with local resources. Culture loses its foundation. People come to rely instead on purely exploitative economic routes, benefiting the elites and maintained by the poor, everyone being a stranger to each other. Since the wealthy have literally nothing else to do, a once practical culture is appropriated and turned into propaganda to protect logistical networks, further enabled by resulting mass delusion. Blah, 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 blah. Good becomes bad, bad becomes good, people become divided, misjudge their worth, and so give their lives to selfish desires, which is easily manipulated by the elite. The measure of a man's worth is no longer based on knowledge of his surroundings and ability to make use of them. Instead, he may survive based on his ability to manipulate others into slowly killing themselves for his own benefit. To convince a stranger to die for you is the epitome, of civility, and so family becomes the basis to teach exploitation, reinforcing at home abusive behavior that make the majority of people anxious, depressed, suicidal, addicted, or violent individuals, and a minority of them into successful sociopaths idolized for their ability to abuse without feeling remorse. Wealth requires all of it, and so genocides are deemed a necessary evil then and now. Physical development sustained by exploitation instead of proximity requires that consciousness serves no other purpose than to justify acting through self-interest, even if this self-interest destroys the cycles that sustain it. Without the daily effort and the extraction and transformation of necessary resources, there is no way for the self to value the things closest to it, whether these things be plants, animals, families, or neighbors. Experience is the only way to quantify and qualify our value so that we may find common ground with others. Without experience and proximity, we have nothing to relate to, and so it becomes possible to abuse others as mere objects. Life is lessons to mean nothing more than self-pleasure. Communication becomes manipulation for unspoken ends, even with family members. The less time spent with family and neighbors, the more they become estranged, while strangers take control of family through school, church, work, retirement homes, shopping centers, social media, etc., etc. So we end up worshiping strangers, idolizing them, and hating family and neighbors because strangers offer us easy but false solution, devoid of hardship, while family members can hold us accountable, which is uncomfortable. To believe in anything but what you can physically sense around you threatens to put you out of touch with reality. All beliefs must be grounded. When proximity is forgotten, resources and people are abused until natural cycles no longer provide them. When proximity is forgotten, resources and people are abused until natural cycles can no longer provide. The global interconnectedness of current resources, transportation, and transformation, the proudest achievement of modern elites, become the main vector of disease, of famine, of violence, and of death. Family and neighbors die forgotten as we are convinced that life is nothing more than instant gratification, which is more easily provided by a slave than by our own honest labor.